things that we need. We'll start out just for a minute in 1 Corinthians 13. And read a few verses there, 13, beginning with verse 6. Friday is Valentine's Day. So there's a lot said around Valentine's Day about love, but not enough said about the love of God, that's for sure. And not enough said about the love of God that ought to be a part of us, that should flow out of us. But 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning with verse 6, it says, it is talking about love. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, this is an important part of our development, right? When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. This is vitally important. Now move back to 1 Corinthians 9, if you will, beginning with verse 24. 1 Corinthians 9, 24 and on. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. The title of the message this morning is Love is Relevant. Love is relevant. I think you all know what relevant means. Relevant is relating to the matter under consideration. It is pertinent. It assumes a connection between what is going on in the world and what we're saying and doing. Being relevant means you have something to say, something to offer that matters and that makes a difference. More than any other people in the world, Christians, and more than any other institution in the world, the church, is meant to be relevant. Our calling to go after and to win and make disciples assumes that we need to be relevant, because potential converts, people that may come to know Christ, live in the world. They live in a context. Relevance is important. When I was growing up, there was still this notion about that some parents had that, and maybe some of you have heard of this, that if you got a cold and you were a little bit sick or you were feeling a little bit run down, one of the best things that could be done to help you was to give you a good dose of physic. Do you know what physic is? It's a laxative. Now, the truth is, of course, that a dose of physic has no point of connection and no curative value when dealing with the common cold or almost anything else besides its very specific use that we won't talk about. In other words, it has not any focus on the issue at hand. It is irrelevant. When it comes to relevance, the example of Paul is an important model that we should not ignore. Paul knows what he's aiming for. And of course, it's important for us to know what we're aiming for. The most obvious thing from these two sports analogies that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 9 is that Paul has the goal of winning in mind. He's very focused on winning the prize that goes to those who pursue the essential objective of Christian service in a focused way. He's determined to win. He says that all runners who run in a race intend to win the prize. I grew up, of course, as a little boy, became a man later, but I remember being a young boy. And I remember being involved in contests at school, and maybe the girls were pretty much the same. But when we were in gym class and we were all lined up on whatever line there was in the gym to begin a race from one end of the gym to the other, I didn't always win, but I never started out with the idea, well, I don't care if I win or not. It's not in my nature. And it ought not be in the nature of the Christian to not care if we win or we lose. He says that all runners who run in the race intend on winning the prize. Now, in Paul's day, a time when the Olympics were just beginning in Greece, they didn't have these medals, the gold and the silver and the bronze medals they do now for any one event. In fact, there was no second or third place. You either won the prize or you didn't win the prize. And the prize was a wreath that the winner wore on his or her head. To the athlete, the cost, the disciplining of the body, the pain, the strict training was worth it for the opportunity to win the prize. The prize is worth the cost of going after it. And we will have to go after it. And we are called by God to pay the price of going after it. We as Christians have a prize in mind that will last for all eternity. And that is the prize. I'm sure when I said that, at least one or two people thought, well, he's talking about standing before Christ and receiving rewards and the crown of faithfulness and hearing Christ say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. I am thinking about that. But the book of 1 Corinthians and the teaching of Paul here has something more immediate in mind that relates to hearing Christ say that and getting those rewards. We as Christians, we do have a prize in mind that will last for eternity, that the church should be reaching for and striving for and working for. And Paul sets the example here. If you still have your Bible open to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning with verse 19, this is what he says, and this is commentary on what we're saying here. He says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To win. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. That they might win. We might win. The prize has to do with these people, these all sorts of people. Some of them under the law, Jews under the law. Some of them Gentiles without the law. Some of them, Paul says, the weak. Some of those maybe of his time that were of great intellect, like Paul was. All kinds of different people. For us, it could be people who grew up in the same sort of religious environment that we did. And maybe those who are completely without religion at all. Some who believe in God and some who do not yet believe in God. People who are nice and people who aren't remotely nice. Not nice at all. People who use drugs and alcohol or alcohol. People who don't use anything like that at all. People who have high moral standards and those who have no moral standards at all. People, regardless of what group they fall into, who do not know Jesus Christ as their Savior. Paul is saying that he is concerned about being relevant, about speaking to people from all different groups and walks of life in such a way as that they might hear the gospel, understand it. Now let me try to focus your mind on what I'm trying to say here. When I was in college, I had a college professor who was a certain sort of person who used a lot of words, very academically advanced words. When he was standing before the student classroom, and he was constantly, at the end of semesters, because we gave feedback at the end, receiving feedback which said that the students didn't understand him because he used words that they had never heard of before in their life. But he kept to his guns, riddling people with little used words that they didn't understand. And with the unintended message to the students. I'm sure he didn't mean to convey this message, but he was conveying the message that they were dumb because they didn't understand. And that they were unimportant because the words that were being used were not helpful to them. When Paul talked to someone who knew the law, he used his understanding of the law that he shared with them to segue respectfully into a presentation of the Lord who fulfills the law. When he spoke to people who didn't have the same religious background, he did not try to impose that on them at the front end as a prerequisite. Instead, to the extent possible, he used things familiar to whoever he was addressing in an effort to reach them. So when Paul did church, He checked his own traditional preferences at the door. Every time Scripture indicates that he left the synagogue to preach somewhere else, whether it was in a home or a lecture hall, wherever he went, he left his own comfort zone because his comfort zone was really the synagogue. And it must have been painful at first, but the aim was to win souls. And that aim called him to places and to do things that he would not himself have chosen. Now, we've often used this illustration, so I'm going to use it again. You ready? If you find a bobby pin, I'll give you $50. All right, so let's use this example, all right? Put your hands together like this. In the most comfortable way. Are you comfortable? Bob, you got to participate. You comfortable? Is this the comfortable way for you? Okay. Not like that, like this. Are you good? Okay. All right. You comfortable? We like to be comfortable. We love to be comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with that. When I bought a car with a seat that I felt like when I sat in it, it was comfortable. Right? I have an easy chair, a recliner in my office in Bucyrus. It's comfortable. But God often calls us out of our comfort. I want you to go down one digit. You're comfortable. If you're right-handed, your right thumb is probably on top. Go down one digit on all of the fingers. The thumb and all the fingers. Down one digit. Do I have to explain it to you again? Okay, you started out comfortable, right? Go down one digit. Okay, how's that feel? It was no easier for Paul than it is for us. God called him out of his comfort zone. He called him to go and minister to people who are not like him. He called him to minister in places that he never would have chosen to go. We can think of all different kinds of people who live in our culture today. We are a segmented culture. We've got bikers. We've got people with lots of tattoos. We've got people with piercings. We've got people that use drugs. We've got people who choose these different lifestyles. I'm not saying anything particularly bad about bikers. Or we've got people who grew up basically like most of us did. Nice people. Never did anything wrong, at least that we let anybody know we did. Things like that. There's all different segments. And you could think of this. And it's difficult sometimes for us to relate to people outside our comfort zone. The first century, the times that Paul lived in and the places that he went were just like this, even more segmented. And it was even more difficult to cross the aisle, so to speak, and speak to people in a group that had so many differences from us. But do you know something? The people across the aisle, if I can use that term, that's probably got political connotations, which I don't mean, but the people in these other groups, they're just like you. Souls for whom Christ died. The younger generations, just like you. Souls for whom Christ died. But It takes effort. Paul uses two very important ideas from the sporting arena to convey this. He uses the word discipline. I remember looking this word up some time ago, and the literal meaning, it's not meant to be taken literally, but the literal meaning for this word discipline is to hit under the eye. The idea is that I work to keep myself under control and to keep myself in harmony with my objective, just like the athlete does. This objective that we have to reach all kinds of people will take discipline. And it involves self-limitation. When I was an athlete, not so many decades ago, I didn't weigh anything near the weight that I weigh now. It took self-limitation. It took watching what I ate. It took discipline. It took exercise. It took discipline. Self-limitation is crucial to being effective for God. Paul uses a case study. And you can read about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. The case study is about Holy Communion. Now, there were people with all different backgrounds, and there was kind of a community cultural background that weighed into this, that was not really godly. They would come to the Lord's table, and they would bring their food from home. Each one would bring what they had at home. And some were wealthy, and they would bring these sumptuous meals that would just fill them until they got sick. And others would come who had nothing. And those who had so much were not even concerned about those who had nothing, because it wasn't within their cultural perspective to be concerned about that. In their culture, those who had nothing deserved to have nothing. From the lens of our reality, from the lens of our perspective, that was just wrong. But how did the situation ever get so far off track in the first place? Well, the fact of the matter is that the situation was very comfortable for those who had much, and it was very normal to them, and it was even normal to those who had nothing. It was their culture. At least to a certain extent. Even though Paul has previously taught the folks the appropriate way to do the Lord's table, the comfortable way persists and has to be challenged once again by the Word of God. Now, for thinking people outside the church, this must have been a stumbling block. As far as reaching unbelievers was concerned, it must have been a stumbling block. Do you think that it became known outside the church that the poor were humiliated? It's quite likely. To the poor and those with compassion on the poor, the church would have become irrelevant through a lack of love. It's possible to be comfortable with a practice or a way of doing things as an individual Christian or as a body that fails to bring glory to Christ and that ought be brought under the control of Christ so that the gospel is not interfered with. Now, I am thankful for the graciousness and the kindness and the sweetness of you all people here. Sometimes we preach to fortify the congregation against trouble that can come, right? Good people here. In a previous pastorate, I remember it started like really small and insignificant thing, a little bit of a problem. It was a little bit of conflict in our Bible studies and adult Sunday school classes. The children got along better than the adults did. Isn't that amazing? Mm. It started as a little bit of respectful disagreement, which was fine. Respectful disagreement is good. It's fine. Sometimes we learn from people who disagree with us. But it moved toward vigorous and at times disrespectful arguments, which some referred to because they were used to this and it was part of their normal as the debate. We have to make a place for the debate. Well, some were hurt by this. Some of the sheep felt like they were bitten by the other sheep by this. What some thought was normal and to be expected hurt other people. And at this point, of course, the arguments had to be brought to a stop, and it was. But think about this for a moment. To someone who doesn't know Christ and who comes with the expectation that he will learn more about God, the God of the Bible, who he doesn't know much about, to be honest. But he has heard the God of the Bible referred to as kind and slow to anger and abounding in love. To him, this sort of thing comes across as being about as relevant as a conversation by phone with space aliens orbiting the Earth. Completely irrelevant, no contact at all with what is needed. These sorts of things that can happen in us, undisciplined, irrelevant habits and side paths that we can get on because we're human, are exactly what Paul means to address in his prize analogy. He says we have to be disciplined, and he says we can be disqualified. And he says he doesn't want to be disqualified, and we ought not want to be disqualified either. Of course, to be disqualified is to be found unfit for the competition or not meeting even the bare minimum requirements for entry into the competition. Very soon we will send Caleb, my fourth of 5, off to boot camp. And he will take his place alongside the other, dare I say it, men. I remember when his older brother Ben was seeking to get into the Marine Corps. He had to meet certain minimum physical requirements just to be allowed to swear in and get in. I remember being out there to some extent when we first started, trying to run along with him and trying to do the pull-ups along with him and the push-ups and the sit-ups, as many as I could. But he had to meet the requirements. He had to officially test and qualify to meet the minimum standards. We're not talking about being the best here. We're talking about just qualifying. Paul talks about our relevance using the word that disqualified, meaning that we can be found to be in want of qualifications. And there's 2 basic assumed qualifying characteristics based on the book of 1 Corinthians. One is self-limitation, which we talked about. Now, obviously, when the Bible talks about self-limitation and the perils of a lack of self-limitation, the biggest things that come to mind are the most catastrophic failures. They have to do with money and sex, obviously. And those failures in these areas, catastrophic failures, can be disqualifying. They can put us into a category of irrelevance, for at least for a while. But he also means to, I think, and has in mind a focus on relevance. Focus on self-limitation when it comes to how I have to have things. Self-limitation and also real love. Not lip service, but real love for others who are starkly different from us. Paul is willing to suffer that others might receive Jesus Christ. He's willing to suffer to bring them the gospel in a way that they can understand it, that connects with them. So there's this great concern for relevance. But Paul will let nothing substitute, even in the cause of trying to make a connection with another person. He will let nothing substitute, and we ought to let nothing substitute for the truth. I've heard a lot of things said about relevance down through the years. I know when we were trying to plan some outreach in a previous pastorate, we were trying to reach as many people as we could. One older gentleman in the congregation said, if you just want a crowd of people, we'll offer free beer for anybody who attends church. We'll offer a free six-pack or whatever. That would be relevant to a lot of people, but it would obscure the truth. 1 Corinthians 13:6 that we read before says, love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. We will never be able to do wrong that good may come of it. In the name of Christ. Love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It rejoices. It has a sense of happiness that something is a good thing and that I'm satisfied and delighted with it. Of course, wrongdoing is any activity which is evil or unjust or unrighteous, just something wrong. One of the chief reasons for irrelevance of local churches in, I don't know if I want to use the adjective many, but it is many places, has to do with this lack of focus on truth. Love rejoices with the truth. We do not love people if we water down the truth and we don't tell them the truth. It's like not correcting your children. Is that love? The victim of a lack of godly relevant focus is the truth today. A real and relevant encounter with the truth. In John 8:31-32, it says, to the Jews who believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. That's what we're here for, right? To make disciples. If you hold to my teachings. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What we have to offer people has nothing to do with our preferences. It has nothing to do with our own personal subculture. We're all part of our own subculture. What we have to offer is the truth. And that will always be relevant. Paul knew he had to delight in the truth, to love it, to hold it forth as nothing else, and be willing to stuff a lot of things back in his pocket that he cherished that were irrelevant and potentially fodder for evil in his dealings with other people who weren't like him? Okay, before we were talking about people who aren't like us. Did you call to mind different groups of people in the culture that you know about? Maybe you notice some of these things in your own kids or grandkids that are not like us. Did you call some of those things to mind? People who aren't like us are about as likely to devote themselves to being like us as I am at 59 years old, likely to devote myself to becoming an astronaut. Not going to happen. Here is what they will devote themselves to. If they hear it and we give it to them in a relevant way, they will devote themselves to the truth. Acts 2:42 says, of the very early disciples, they, the Christians converted on the day of Pentecost under the ministry of the apostles, that's what we're talking about. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Now notice in there the first thing listed and the foundational thing is the truth. The apostles' teaching. It was foundational to everything else. And it was life-changing. It is the most effective thing in all the world. The truth. When it is presented in an unadorned, not loaded down with a bunch of things that are irrelevant way. Now consider this for a moment. Imagine how easy, given human nature, it would have been for the crowd that heard the gospel on the day of Pentecost to have gotten caught up with aspects of the heritage that they were now a part of. They might have gotten caught up with the upper room experience and have found themselves focused on comparing stories with one another about various upper room events, like the sound of the rushing mighty wind that came from heaven. But no, they didn't do that. They realized that the truth was essential, and the things that happened around the truth to point to the truth were just that, pointers to the truth. They did not seek to build a monument to the rushing mighty wind, as precious as that experience must have been for some of them. Going forward, many would be saved who would not share that experience and would not have been able to relate to it. Yet, by the truth, shared in the love of Christ, they would be set free. Love is relevant. It's always relevant. Inherent in this message this morning of the relevance of love is a sense of urgency about it. Many of you, maybe all of you, know that part of my job in my secular work is to go to emergency rooms and jail, police stations, schools, wherever events may have occurred, and evaluate people who others have a concern or they have a concern that they might be unsafe. They might be unsafe to themselves or they might be unsafe to others. And I'll sit with them and they meet me for the first time and they have no reason to trust me. I wouldn't, if I were them, have a reason to trust me either. Why? I try to make a connection with them, one of the things that I try to make plain to them is that the most important thing to me right now in this moment is you. I don't have a concern in those moments about my feelings or what I like, what I'd like to be doing right now, what's on the TV in the emergency room, what might be on Facebook right now, what might be on my emails. I care about you. We are called to such an attitude with anybody that we might encounter, unbeliever, doesn't know Christ. What is more important than your soul? Nothing. And in our way of being with the unbeliever, they ought to sense that to the very core of their being. God allows them to do so, that there's nothing more important to me than your soul. I'm not concerned right now about being comfortable. Remember that. Bring it down a digit again. Feel it. In dealing with people in my secular work, there's so many times I feel like that. I feel like that. Maybe that. Very uncomfortable. But it's not about me. It's not about us in our work for the kingdom. It's about Him. And it's about our calling. Love is relevant. Will you stand? Number 232 in your songbooks, verses 1, 4, and 5. 232. Just as I am.